Okay, so this talk is about putting Spring Framework and Magnolia CMS together. Really what it's about is sort of what the framework looks like that ShareCare has been working with for the last few years, and how we assembled these pieces to get use out of them. So, a couple different steps that we'll be going through. First, we'll talk a bit about ShareCare and CMS in general. What ShareCare is, why we needed a CMS, what our use case was for that, why we chose Magnolia as that CMS, and then we'll get into actually showing the code working and show you how that's all put together. So for that, we'll be talking about request routing, we'll be talking about data and activation, we'll be talking about single sign-on, and then edge side includes, which is where everybody usually wants to run away. All right, so first up, ShareCare and CMS. So, what is ShareCare? ShareCare is a company that was a collaboration between Jeff Arnold, Dr. Oz, Oprah, Sony, and Discovery, and there are a bunch of other companies that have contributed now too, but that was the original partnership. There's an urban legend story about it that goes around the office. I don't know if it's actually true, but the theory goes that one day Jeff, and if you guys don't know, Jeff Arnold is the guy who did WebMD. So one day Jeff and Oprah and Dr. Oz were sitting around talking, and apparently Dr. Oz asked Jeff, so if you had WebMD to do all over again, how would you do it differently? And so they got to talking about that, and the idea for a company was born. So there are many different versions of the story of how Jeff would do it differently, but my understanding of it is it comes down to this. First and foremost, he felt like WebMD was too encyclopedic. It wasn't very personal. People didn't feel like it was related to them. It was just like looking something up in a textbook. So he felt like if he had it to do over again, he would have made it much more personalized, much more humanized. Second thing is, social media didn't exist when WebMD was created, and he felt like there were a lot of opportunities to integrate social media into a medical information type website. And then finally, the big thing that Jeff wanted was a site that was focused on not just providing people information, but trying to get people to actually take action based on that information. So that was where we were born. How that led into CMS. So when we sat down, started talking about what the framework was that we needed to build, first thought we had is, this is really a content site. They're going to have thousands of questions and answers, articles, quizzes, all these sorts of things that you would want to manage as content with a CMS. But it was also going to be a social media site. We were going to have social graph. We were going to have activity, following, messaging, gamification, all of those things that you would put into a fully dynamic, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn type of experience. Really not very CMS friendly at all. And we are also going to do fitness tracking. We were going to want to have these calls to action where people would actually be interacting with the system, doing things, using it as an app. But the bigger problem was we do it all on the same page. So if you look at this page, and this is at least the point in time of what the profile page looked like a couple months ago, what you've got on here is you've got information that's coming out of the content repository that you want to manage like CMS. You've got information coming out of a database that's your traditional information about users and data in the system. You've got user-generated content where users are taking action, and that's all pushing up into the experience. And you're just sort of munging it all together as if it was all the same stuff. And that created a big problem because most of the systems I've worked on, they use CMS, they use dynamic experiences, but they didn't mingle them. What normally would happen is the thing that you wanted to be managed content would kind of sit over on the side. You'd have a place where you published articles, but you didn't do that with like the user's homepage. So where we basically came to was we needed to put the two things together. We needed to have a full enterprise CMS that gave us that kind of control over our data, and we needed to have a full custom framework where we could implement whatever we wanted with whatever degree of flexibility we needed to have on that. And that was kind of a challenge. So we mulled and we looked and we experimented, and we finally landed on this little thing called Magnolia. At the time, actually, I had never heard of Magnolia. I'd be surprised if most of you have actually heard of Magnolia because it has a much bigger footprint in Europe than it does in the US. So I was kind of sticking my neck out saying, hey, this looks pretty cool, we should think about it. But the reasons why were there were a few very obvious ones. First was, the more I dug into the source code of Magnolia, the more I realized that everything in the system from the ground up was built to be modular and extensible. So every single system, subsystem within it, there's an interface, there's an implementation for that interface, there's a configuration that associates the implementation with the interface, and you can go in and you can make your own, you can use the one that's there, you can combine the two. It's extremely flexible in that way. And that fit the model of we were going to need to customize this a lot. Second reason is Spring MVC was, from our perspective, where we wanted to be in terms of a web framework. And the technologies that Magnolia was built around were extremely friendly with Spring MVC. Drops into a normal servlet container, it actually runs as a filter, so it doesn't directly conflict with the controller for the servlet controller for Spring. And it just was very similar technology, in particular because as we dug into it, we discovered this thing called Blossom. And Blossom is a weird little critter. What they have done with Blossom is where a normal CMS would have some sort of a templating language that you would use. In Java, that would normally be JSP or Velocity or FreeMarker. Magnolia did all of that, and then they went and plugged in a Spring MVC servlet as a template engine that you could use. So what Blossom does is it essentially allows you to be using Spring for your front end and also be using Spring to manage the individual templates within Magnolia itself. So you get a very homogeneous environment. Yeah, I see someone making a face at me. I'll show you in a minute. But you end up with an extremely homogeneous environment where things look very consistent all the way across the experience that the developers are working in. They may be glaring at me too, but I'll show you. And the other thing is Magnolia is open source. Like I said, I spent a lot of time looking at the source code of Magnolia, and it's not like there are a lot of CMSs out there that are commercial. Things like, I don't know, I don't want to start naming names, but anyway, there are a lot of enterprise class CMSs that claim to be open source, but it's sort of like open source on a leash. Magnolia is not. Magnolia, the source code's all up in Git. You can just go grab it and do whatever you need to with it. Okay, so that's why Magnolia. Now from here, I wanted to spend the bulk of the talk actually going and showing you things. Before I do, I'm going to jump over, because it was pointed out to me that at this point, most of you have never seen Magnolia, so you don't actually know what it is. So give the guys from Magnolia a moment to come up and actually give you a quick walkthrough of the functionality of Magnolia, and then we'll jump back into. And my apologies ahead of time because they had to drop their slides into Keynote, and some of them don't like it very well.
Okay, thanks, Casey. So I'm Brian Warwick. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Magnolia. So, yeah, no worries. And so what I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about is just a technology overview. So you can think of this like the commercial that's running in either YouTube or Hulu. So it'll be over really in just a second here. But so a little bit about Magnolia. As Casey said, it's a pretty extensible system, and we like to think that we're a bit beyond just a normal CMS. We really think really kind of an integration point for any of your internal systems, whether they be any kind of database, your analytics engine, commerce, CRM. Most websites today are a collection of dynamic information along with any kind of static content that you would normally manage in a CMS. So we like to give you the opportunity to take all that, put it together, and then really share it across any particular viewpoint that the user has. So mobile, tablet, we fully support responsive design. So we'll detect your device and give a mobile experience to a mobile user without having to do too much variation in your site itself. One of the key pieces of this is the JCR, and so we're actually sitting on top of Apache Jackrabbit, which is both JSR 170 and 283 compliant. Brings a lot of benefits, obviously, but we are a layer on top of that. So if you wanted to potentially use another JCR, you could. Be a lot of work, but this slide. So apparently there are no benefits at all to using a JCR. But this is the one of those PowerPoint evils. But there's a couple of things about JCR that are pretty good if you haven't used one. All of the content for your site, so both text and images, video, can all be stored in the same place. You don't have to know too much about the content and where it's at. You use the same APIs to get to it as you would really for all of it. It also, because it's Java-based, it promotes standardization and compatibility, interchangeability, which is all good. The other thing that it does is you can actually persist your JCR in the file system or any number of relational databases, and you pretty much don't care. You don't need to know where it's sitting because you're using that standard API. And then the other, I think, big thing that comes with the JCR is this concept of observation. So anytime a node in the JCR changes, you can take action upon that in your code. So you don't have to constantly be polling it. You can, through some of the mechanisms of the JCR, just pick that change up. As Casey said, it is a modular system, and what you see, kind of the green on the bottom, is our core code. It is open source, so you have total access to that. We've got actually two flavors of the system. One is a community edition, and then one is the enterprise edition that comes at a license cost. What changes is the lighter green boxes on top in the enterprise edition. You obviously get more features and functions that come with that. So one of those light green boxes would actually be the Blossom module that Casey spoke a little bit about and is going to show you a lot more of. But that sits on top of our core code, so if you want to use it, you can. If you don't want to use it, you don't even need to plug it in. And as I said, I promised that would be brief, so my name is now First Last. Probably should have quality controlled this before it went out the door. One other note, just quick before I leave, we do have some laptop sleeves in the back, so if anybody's interested in grabbing some of those, please feel free. And if anybody's going to hang out for a little while after, we'll be happy to buy some drinks and chat a little bit. So, thank you.
Alrighty. So, putting it together. All right. One quick note before we start diving into the code. Everything you're going to see is in an open source demo application that is up on GitHub. I'll give these slides to you guys so you can distribute afterwards, but it's there. It's available freely for you to download, use however you want. I realized after I had built the demo a few months back, I started looking at it, and it's like, this is about 85% of the way towards being a fully working site that somebody could just drop and start using. So if you wanted to do that, sure, go for it. Royalty free. I don't remember which license I picked for it, but it's something very easygoing. Okay, so first thing up, the integration between Magnolia and Spring MVC really comes down to request routing. I mean, that's the heart of it. The beauty is that Spring's a servlet, Magnolia's a filter, and that means all you have to do to get these things to play nicely is really get your web XML within your container configured so that it knows which thing goes where. In our case, what we do is we configure Magnolia gets everything that's .html, Spring gets everything else. So the effect of that is this. Any request that comes to our application, every single request goes to Spring. Hits Spring MVC, goes to a Spring controller. Spring is in complete control over what's going to happen as a result of that request occurring. So what this means is that for a lot of things, like if we're building data services that are just returning JSON, they don't touch Magnolia at all. It's pure Spring MVC. However, for web pages, what's going to happen is your controller executes, does whatever operation was requested, and then at the presentation tier, where you would normally be returning back a reference to a JSP file, I'm actually returning back a reference to the location of the .html that corresponds to a template within Magnolia. So in effect, Magnolia is just my templating layer like a normal JSP or FreeMarker or Velocity template would be. And then Magnolia, in turn, invokes the template that is associated with that page URL that I've given it, does whatever it needs to in order to generate the page and spits the result back out. So the overall overarching concept of this is, if you think about an MVC architecture, Spring is the controller and Magnolia is the view, sitting side by side within the same servlet context. So, next step, demo. Let me actually show you these pieces put together. So, start at a normal controller. We'll go with the simplest one, the home page. So if you've used Spring MVC at all, this is a completely vanilla controller. There is nothing the least bit interesting going on here. It looks exactly like any other controller you would write. The only thing that's different is this right here would normally be pointed at a file. But in this case, it's not pointed at a file. It's pointed at a page defined within the Magnolia servlet container, or within the Magnolia system. So what does that mean? So for the most part, it doesn't mean a lot of change. You still end up with normal things, like this is my page template for a page with one column. It's a normal JSP, looks just like any other JSP. The only thing that looks the least bit weird is down here you've got this little tag called CMS area name header, CMS area name main column. So what this is Magnolia's syntax for setting up a page template so that you have a generic container you can then drop components into. And then in turn, so here's a nice little simple example of a component that I can drop in there. This just has a div that has some body text in it and maybe a title. I believe I can. Let me see if I can figure out how. That's what I thought. No version of Command Plus seems to want to do it. Nope. There we go. It was this one. Alrighty, is that more readable? So again, this is just a JSP fragment. The only thing that is the least bit specific is that I've got this notion of a content node that's being passed in. So we were talking about the JCR before. That's just the node from the JCR that defines this particular content element. So in this sense, I've got a controller. The controller's pointed at JSPs. That's all fairly normal. What changes is, and this is where Blossom comes in, these elements get registered. Get bigger. There we go. So this looks like a page controller like you would expect to see in Spring MVC, but it's not. It's actually a controller for a specific template. So this one column page template that I showed you before, this JSP is now known to Magnolia as a template for pages because I have created a controller for it that maps an identifier to the particular JSP that I want to show. So this one I've got some fancier stuff for handling breadcrumbs and title and things, but in general, what this is this is just a mapping so that Magnolia understands, hey, when I say I want to use a one-column template, I mean I want to use this JSP file. In the same way that formatted text thing we were looking at a minute ago, is again just another controller. This one's pretty simple. I'm just mapping the JSP that I want from it. The other thing that's occurring in here, and this is where you start getting those benefits of doing this in a CMS instead of doing it separately, is that I've also defined a dialog factory for this. So if you wanted to be able to code by hand in a Spring MVC application the ability to arbitrarily drop in some more text on a page, what you have to do is you have to go write all of the elements to be able to control letting somebody have that ability, capturing that information in a form, printing it out. Because I'm using Magnolia, and this is a Magnolia component, all I have to do is define a little dialog saying I want this to have a title and I want this to have a body. Now, let me show you how that all comes together. This that you're looking at is assembled entirely from the pieces you just saw. There is no other programmatic component associated with it other than that. So what it consists of is, well, let me jump back real quick. So a page definition that has as its template the one column template that we were talking about before. And then when I go in to edit that, this is the main column, that main area. So this right here, where I've defined CMS area main column, that becomes this container right here. And when I click inside of that container, I can drop new components in at will. So I can come in here to one of these and I can say edit it, edit the text that I'm going to have on there. Save that. Preview the results. Yes, I like them. Publish it. Now if I go back here and refresh the page, no, not form submission. Just load the page again. And you see my change is now there. So just like that, just by using Magnolia as the way to assemble the JSPs instead of hand coding the JSPs myself, I now have the ability to go in and live modify this site and make changes to it pretty much as I need to. And that becomes a design aspect of your individual components. Now this one is extremely generic. I've just come in here and said, oh. Come here and said, hey, let's add a new one. I can say add more formatted text, choose, and I've added more stuff on here, and I can move it around. And I'm editing the page. So that's the basic assembly of how this works. Now, let me show you a different example that shows you a little bit more about how it can get cool, how it can be useful. So also in here, I've got this guy, which is the edit user profile. Very normal JSP like you would want it to be. But it sounds like somebody's having a lot of fun next door. We may be at the wrong meeting. Okay, so when I go in here, same sort of thing again. Let's go look at something like this. So here we have one that's a little bit more sophisticated. Got multiple, I'll do that. Got multiple columns here, multiple elements on it. So now I can do things like, let's go here. So this is the form we're looking at right now. So you see I've got my red articles down here, I've got suggested articles over here. So if somebody says, you know what, I don't like that. I want the red articles to be over on the right-hand column. This is the kind of ticket we get all the time. It's like, okay, file a ticket, wait 2 weeks for it to get into an iteration, then wait another 2 weeks for the iteration to complete. It goes through QA, and this will be out on the site sometime in a month and a half or so for this little change. Now, in this model, instead of that, I can just come over here and say, you know what? I want to put the red articles over on this side. If I can spell. And don't want it over there anymore. All right, so let's preview this. Yeah, that's the way I want it. Publish. No, that was not the publish. That's the publish. There we go. So now, same page, and I just move the content over. So this is what we were really trying to get to, is a place where I can make dynamic application using the same sort of structures, controllers, and JSPs that I would normally use, but hand off to non-programmers the ability to go in and modify the site at will and have that kind of control over it. So, all right, so that's enough of that part of it. Get the basic process of that. Next one. This is where things start getting a little bit trickier. So data activation. The problem is silos of data. Friends from Magnolia were talking about the JCR. The JCR is awesome. The problem is the JCR is not my live database that I'm using to perform operations on the site. So I run into real troubles when we start having different silos of data that aren't intermingled with each other. You know, because I have situations where I need to put data into the view templates that's in the database, or I need to put JCR content, you know, into a place where I can actually operate upon it and make decisions. Like I need to know whether there's a topic page in the system, a link to something, before I can actually send up a user to it. So exposing that content gets a little tricky because you can query the JCR, and the JCR is a very cool tool. But the JCR is kind of like a fancy file system. And what that means is that your semantics for being able to query it and the performance of those queries is nothing like what you're going to expect from something like MySQL or MongoDB. It's really going to burn you. I mean, I'm not saying that there was a day when ShareCare crashed because somebody was running a JCR query that shouldn't have been in the JCR, but just say you probably don't want to do too much of that. So for our uses, when we want these two systems to work together, what we have found is that it's usually a better practice if you're going to have data that you're creating in Magnolia, but you're using in a lot of different places in the site, to synchronize that data between the JCR and the other database. And it turns out that's really easy to do in Magnolia, and I will show you how. So, get these guys out of the way. In Magnolia, there is a notion of activation commands. What an activation command is, think of it kind of like a filter on the publication process. Anytime something is published, anytime something is activated in Magnolia, anytime something is deactivated in Magnolia, it will go through and it will invoke any activation commands that you have registered upon that. So what that means is that you can create something like this, which, when it gets executed, is going to go through and say, hey, I am the activation command for articles, so is this an article? Yes, good. I want to grab that and I want to publish it into the database. And so then I've got logic down here that is just basically doing that. It's taking that node, it does one of two things. It looks to see if the article already exists. If it does, it updates the date when it was published. If it doesn't exist already, I assemble it from the node, write it out to the database. And there's another one I can show you if you want to see it, but there's a deactivation command that does the exact opposite on the other side. So essentially what this does is it means that I cannot publish a piece of data within my system that fits this pattern without it being synchronized to my database. If the database operation fails, if it doesn't write to the database, it's going to fail this, and that will fail the activation. So through that mechanism, you can actually pretty reliably keep these disparate systems constantly in sync. More importantly, it lets you do it on the JCR side and on the Magnolia side once you're ready to publish. So you can create the content, you can test the content out, you can look at it on your content management, and then when it's time to say, yes, I want this live on the system, that's the point where it actually goes into your database and it starts turning on for functions that are connected to that particular data set. So for us, this has ended up being very useful at times. Topic is one of the good ones. But anyway, the only other thing that you have to do is you have to actually register that. Where is it? That guy. All right. So another lovely thing that we have found very useful with Magnolia. Magnolia has this notion of what they call a bootstrap. And what the bootstrap essentially does is you can put an XML file into the bootstrap directory, and when Magnolia starts up, it goes out and it finds all these XML files, and it just directly puts that data into the JCR. So nobody has to go in. You could actually go into the JCR interface and do this manually, but it's a pain. Nobody wants to do that. As a developer, you want to write your class, write this little XML snippet, put that in the source code, and when they turn it on, this all gets registered up and everything works. So all this really does is it says in the JCR at /config/modules/activation/commands/versions/activate, I want to add a new node called article activation. And that node points at this class, which is the class you were just looking at. So you create that XML file, and you have basically just gone in and made changes to the JCR of the live system when this build goes out. So that's essentially it. That is data activation, which doesn't seem all that fancy, but trust me, it's a great benefit. Questions about that? Because that gets kind of thick.
Do you have any granularity in the security, like what users can go in and edit different parts of the...
Actually, the very next topic is single sign-on, and I can show you how we do that when we get there. But yes. Anything else? All righty. So, single sign-on. We've got exactly the situation that you're talking about. I've got a Magnolia CMS system. It has its own notion of a user and what users can do. I've got my front-end application, which we're running Spring and Spring Security, and we have our notion of users and what users can do. Having to constantly flip back and forth between those two is a real pain. So in order to deal with that, well, let's get into a couple things first. First is authentication versus authorization, which sort of goes to the heart of the question you were asking. When we start talking about single sign-on, first thing you have to do is you have to differentiate between the notion of defining who someone is versus defining what someone has the right to do. And the reason for that is single sign-on is not an equal partnership. I've done a lot of SSO implementations at this point, and there is no such thing as equal sharing. When you do single sign-on, somebody has to be the boss. Somebody has to be the authority that says, I am the person who determines who someone is, and everyone else has to believe me. A good example of this would be if you've ever used Facebook to allow you to sign someone into your site. You have no involvement with defining who that person is. Facebook is in charge of determining that person's identity, and you have to trust them. Single sign-on pretty much invariably works that way. After that, the next step is figuring out how to share that. And most of the work with creating a single sign-on system is actually entirely about trying to figure out how to securely share who somebody is with the different systems that are integrating with it. And then finally, the last piece of this is authorization. What can this person do? That invariably ends up having to be a system-level decision of the particular system. So when you look at our implementation of single sign-on within ShareCare, what you would find is that within the Spring application, Spring is the authority making the decision about whether or not a user can take an action. Within Magnolia, Magnolia is the authority of deciding whether or not a user can take an action. What single sign-on provides is the ability to authenticate a user a single time and know who that user is, so that both of those systems can then look at a common view of that user. Okay, so the integration points for this, and I'll show you this code in a second. But the way that Magnolia makes this very, very easy for us is that model I was talking about to begin with of the separation of interface versus implementation for different subsystems. Because within Magnolia, Magnolia has a notion of a user manager. And the user manager interface is what Magnolia uses to go and get a user record. You've got the notion of a user itself, which is the model that Magnolia uses to describe what a user is. You've got a login module, which is the piece of code that Magnolia uses to attempt to log a user in and attempt to log a user out. And then, depending on what you're doing, there's also a login handler that you use to initiate an attempt at authentication. The important fact is, all four of these things are interfaces. And Magnolia doesn't actually care what implementation of it you use. All you have to do is tell Magnolia, this is the class that I want you to use as the login module, and it will. So, let me show you the classes I've told it to use as a login module. Which way am I going? There. All right, so this is the user manager. This is their, we were talking about it a minute ago, the notion of deciding the way to get a user. So, yes. Okay. So, the interface within Spring is user manager. That is the interface they use for deciding who a user is. They've made this lovely thing called external user manager that's an abstract class which basically takes care of all the mechanisms for needing to plug some external third-party thing into the system as a login manager. You just extend that, and pretty much all you have to do is implement get user, and you're done. So in this case, what I've done is I've made this guy implement application context aware, because this is a bean created by Magnolia, so it's not a Spring managed bean, so I have to get the context manually. I pull in my user repository. Spring says, okay, here's the name of a user. Who is that? I build my user record and return it back. So at that point, I have now given Magnolia a way to know who my users are from the name based purely on the username that the user is going to enter in, without having to know anything about my user database. The next piece is the login module. And you'll notice the same exact pattern has happened here again, is that they've got this notion of a JCR authentication module. I have extended that and just plugged in my own implementation. So there's a login method, there's a logout method. Those use validate user and match password. So the guts of it is, and you'll see this in a second, there's when the Magnolia login screen comes up, it has a blank for a username, it has a blank for a password. Type two values in, hit go. It takes the value that I typed in user, calls the user manager class we just looked at, gets back the user object. Then it calls this class and says, attempt to validate this user. In that process, it's going to match password, which is just going to take that user record I gave it, do a get password, and return it back. And this logic, this isn't Magnolia logic. Magnolia doesn't know anything about this. All Magnolia is saying is, hey, I need to validate the user object, so validate the user object. And I've written the code to do that. So now somebody can go and they can log in to the Magnolia system using a user I've created. The only thing else that's going on here, and this gets to the question of authorization, is you'll notice that I'm building, oh, where'd he go? No, that's the code I meant to hit. So, within Magnolia, Magnolia has a certain model for roles and groups that it uses for authorization. I didn't do much with it because I didn't want to get too fancy with trying to go crazy with what I was doing in the demo app. But you can see here, when I'm creating this user object that I'm passing back to Magnolia, I have complete control of setting the roles and groups. So if you looked in ShareCare's code base, what you would find is that I've got a user object in my database, not in Magnolia. That user object has user rights associated with it, roles and groups. And some of those in our class we've actually marked as saying, this one's shared with the CMS. And so when we build our object that we pass to the CMS, we go ahead and pass in those roles and groups. And that's how Magnolia is able to determine what someone should or shouldn't be able to do. So even though it's Magnolia performing the authorization, all of the information actually comes from outside of Magnolia, and Magnolia just believes us because that's what we've written it to do. Okay, questions? There's one other question that should probably be popping to mind, and that comes down to this guy. Because this has to go two directions. What I showed you up till now is just the authentication side of it. The next piece is, how do I share that information with the other system? And so what you will find here is in this login module that we were just looking at, once I have successfully logged someone in, I call my session manager class to create the session. And what session manager is doing is actually going and creating the Spring security context and setting a cookie that can be used by the Spring filter to reinstantiate it. So this is that final closing the loop on that single sign-on process. Is I log in through Magnolia, Magnolia authenticates the user, and then actually kicks off the process that creates the security context so that my Spring container also now knows who that user is and can perform authorization actions against them. Does that make sense? So, sounds really complicated, but honestly, you're talking about like 4 classes I had to create to wire this whole thing up. So it was actually really very straightforward to do once you understand the different interfaces you have to implement. All right. So, enough with the fun stuff. There is one other piece. Well, you guys already see me log in, so you see how that works. So there's one other piece that I wanted to show you about how we integrate with Magnolia. Show of hands, how many people know what an edge side include is? Yeah, small number. I know you know. So edge side includes are a really, really awesome little piece of technology that you will probably at some point want to avail yourself of, or at least have an opportunity where you really could have benefited from it. Basically what it is it's a tag that you put into in your HTML source that's getting generated. Looks just like that. Kind of works like an SSI. So you're basically saying, hey, here's a piece of remote content that I want to put into this page right here. This was created by Akamai. And when Akamai first started offering it, it was this really fancy feature that you could pay Akamai lots of money for. And a lot of people didn't, because then they knew if they ever did that, they could never, ever not use Akamai, that they were just married to Akamai for the rest of their life. So Akamai eventually caved and made it an open standard, which many things now do. I'm using Varnish to do all of the demos that you're going to see with this. There are several. Squid also supports it. So most of the caching proxy layers out there know how to deal with ESIs. The benefit of the ESI is, like I said, you put this tag into your page, and it will go and fetch another piece of content, bring that in, and dynamically insert it into your page, replace it with the tag. Okay, so what's the big deal? Why do you want to do that? So the reason you want to do this is because you've got a very traditional problem with caching. And that problem is, I want to cache everything because that makes my site run faster because I have to do less operations. But every time I cache something, I'm running the risk that somebody's seeing some piece of content that's out of date, that's going to make my site look bad. And That's really a problem at the page level because, if you think back to that page I showed you earlier that was showing sort of how we put everything together onto a page with our social media stuff, the different content elements on that page all have very different life cycles in terms of how you would want to cache them. The information about who the user is and their biography and that sort of thing, that information changes very infrequently. The counts about how many people somebody's following, how many people are following them, that changes a little more frequently, but not like every second. The activity wall, which is kind of like a Twitter timeline, things on that could be changing every single second. So trying to come up with some sort of a caching rule for how I'm going to cache that whole page is just terrible because you ultimately end up not being able to cache at anything more granular than the most frequently updated piece of content on the page, which in that case would mean I have to refresh that page every single time somebody loads it from scratch. I can't cache it at all. What ESIs let you do is break that page up and cache the individual pieces separately so that you can have different rules. I can say, this little chunk over here, I want you to load a new copy of that once an hour. This little chunk over here, don't cache it at all. Load it every time. This chunk up here, keep it for a month. It's never going to change. And that gives you the ability to much more efficiently tweak the performance of your site so that you're putting the as least load as possible. The problem is, this is a real pain in the rear end to manage. When you start thinking about taking all of the bits of your content, breaking them out into separate sections, putting little tags in place of them, keeping track of what the different caching rules are for those different pieces, it's kind of just annoying. And that's why a lot of people, even the people who have Akamai and have the ability to use it, don't end up using it very much because it's just a lot of work. It turns out Magnolia, for reasons I have never figured out because no one has explained to me any function for it other than this, and as far as I'm aware, no one other than ShareCare ever thought of doing this with it, so I don't know why they did it at all. But Magnolia implemented itself in such a way that every single component on a page can actually be rendered independently. And I'll show you an example of that. So let's look at the home page. So when I look at this page, you see all of these pieces on there. If I instead come in here and say, yes. So you remember before there was an area on the page called main column. If I come in and I type, I want to go to /home/main column/0, that will actually render whatever the 0th item in that collection was directly without rendering the rest of the page. Again, I have no idea why they did this. It's a weird function. But it comes in handy. And the reason it comes in handy is you can actually harness it to make ESIs a lot easier to deal with. So I'll show you the code of this. This will sound really scary, but when I show you the code at the end, it will be much simpler. What's essentially going to happen here is, first of all, we don't change the front. We're totally at the wrong meeting. You don't have to change the front-end controller at all. Your actual control logic in Spring doesn't know anything about this and doesn't care. The template controller is the one that actually does all of the work. So for a particular component, some little chunk of your page, what we've done is we have created logic to make that template controller understand what the cache frequency is, and it manages that by being able to generate a version ID for the content at any given time. What is required to render that particular content for some sort of a remote request from an ESI, and then we just put it together. So what we did is we made an abstract base controller that individual component templates can extend that sort of templated out how to create this functionality. And it does all the work. So let me show you that code, because that sounds really, really horrible. They're very happy about this code. So the abstract base paragraph controller right here. So this is the component definition for an article. So like we were looking at pages where, let's go back. So I picked some article. So this is an article page. This is the component that actually renders this chunk of the page in the middle that says what the article content is. So once you have this abstract paragraph controller in place, the only thing that's really happening is I have to implement a get version. And all I did is say, okay, the version is the timestamp, which means the URL will be the same until somebody publishes the article again. If they publish a new version of the article, I update the timestamp. That means this URL is now different. I have a update model and a get parameters method. All those are just the reverse of each other. The first one takes the model that was passed to it and turns that into a set of key value pairs. The second one will take that set of key value pairs, turn it back into the model that it started with. So this is that glue that allows the ESI to work, where it can compute the URL that it needs to generate, putting those key value pairs in as parameters, and then when it gets the request from Akamai, strip that back out and turn it back into the model so that it knows what article object it's dealing with. Seems like a lot of work, but remember, the benefit of this is, normally if I were talking about caching an article, you're going to have this conversation that I've had many times with product managers where it's like, okay, how often do you publish changes to this article? They're like, well, we only do it about once a month. It's like, okay, and when you make a change to that article, how soon do you want people to see that update? And they'd be like, oh, I want them to see it immediately. Okay, so what you're telling me is that my cache frequency on this needs to be about 10 minutes. Even though you only change it once a month, I can only hold this in cache for about 10 minutes, and then I've got to render it again. In this model, this is going to generate an ESI. That ESI is tied to the version, which means once I render that, unless and until it changes, I can cache it forever. And the instant they make a change, I now refresh the cache. So the cache bust happens completely automatically and is instantaneous. And I'll show you, because what you were looking at here looks like this page, but this was actually the address of my varnish box. If I change that to the actual Tomcat box, you notice the article has now gone away. And that's because instead of the article, what's actually getting rendered by my template is this guy. And I'll just make it bigger. So you see it's done an ESI include. And that ESI include has my base ESI controller, the timestamp for the article, and then the path to the particular component that I'm trying to render. And then finally it has URL equals syndrome X, so I know which article this was for. So when this page gets rendered, my front-end caching proxy controller is going to hit that, look up in the cache, and say, hey, do I have this URL? I've got it, no problem, I'll just give it back to you. My application server doesn't have to do a thing. On the other hand, if it doesn't have it, then it issues the request back. This guy gets that string object parameters, which would be the URI equals syndrome X, fetches the article for that, sticks it back into the model, and then that invokes the JSP. And so from that, you get this page. But if I go into the app, where'd it go? And I say, it hates me when I do that. No. This is what happens when I try to do a demo. Well, that's because it's not in the database. It's getting mad at me. Anyway, you get the point. Once I publish that out, the change becomes instantaneously visible. And this is really nice when you're dealing with Akamai, because basically that request never even comes to your site. Doesn't hit your infrastructure, renders straight out. So anyway, questions about that? Because I will tell you that I get lots of questions about it from the people who work with me.
Does that mean you have to think about when you construct all of the articles, how you're going to cache parts? Or do they build an article that's 15 or 30 paragraphs?
It would vary depending on the data itself. So in the case of an article, usually that's going to be a big chunk of content, and so you can do it sort of as a whole thing. A lot of these, the way that I have poked at it, are things like I really try to break it up into very granular chunks, because what I'm trying to get to is every distinct piece of data is going to have a distinct life cycle. So once I can quantify that object as a single component on the page, then I can compute a version for that object, and at that point my cache frequency becomes eternal. And I don't worry about how often that object has to change and how often I need to bust the cache at all. So the answer generally would be whatever the life cycle of stuff is. If it's all grouped together with a single life cycle, I'd probably want to put it all together in a single component with a single version. If it has different life cycles, break it up. Other questions?
When you use the timestamp like that you mentioned, are there any issues with the time changes, DSP changes, or?
No, because as far as the caching proxy server is concerned, it doesn't know that's a timestamp. All it knows is that you have said cache this URL forever, and so when you change that URL, it then doesn't have that in its cache, and it has to go get it again, and then it caches that one forever.
What's the advantage of using time versus just a sequence number kind of thing?
Would work fine too. I just used a timestamp because it was really easy. I was capturing a timestamp of when I was publishing the article anyway. Other questions? The next slide was just questions. That's it?
Can I understand that this is running within the same Tomcat as the rest of your app?
It is the app. And that's actually one of the hardest learning curves about this, I would say, for the developers that work with it, is there's this real tendency to think of, oh, is it Spring or is it Magnolia? You know, think of them as being two distinct applications. And in effect, what happens when you glue these pieces together like this is they become a single application. In the same way that you wouldn't think of your Spring controller and your JSP as being two different applications. It just is, there's a difficult mental barrier to get over there to start thinking of it as I've got a single application that consists of both Spring and Magnolia.
So just we're scaling it out horizontally, scaling it out horizontally where you need multiple instances of your application.
So that gets into a lot of the enterprise features for Magnolia. Magnolia out of the box, the community edition, works great for a single server. When you want to start putting out multiple copies of something so that you're load balancing across multiple servers, the tools that come with the enterprise license are really focused around that. So it's how to do transactional publication so that you know that every single front-end server actually got the activated change before it shows up on the site and that sort of thing. Backup is handled that way. So yeah, it's basically a horizontal scale model for the JCR because the JCR doesn't know anything about the other front-end nodes. You just have a full copy of the JCR on every single front-end box. Kind of like this, if you were dealing with JSPs instead, you would have all of your JSPs on each of those boxes.
Now scaling your database itself, that's always where the fun comes in.
That's a whole different fun feature to itself.
Yep.
What is your infrastructure?
So we run Tomcat on Linux. We run Spring MVC and Magnolia. The back database is MongoDB primarily. We have Solar. We do some MySQL that's entirely because we bought other companies that used MySQL and we haven't rewritten all their stuff yet. We also got some SQL Server that way as well. There are some other components in there, Perl and .NET and other things that are, again, things that we bought that we're saddled with now, maintaining them until we get time to rewrite them. But the core application itself is pure Spring running in Tomcat on Linux with a MongoDB backend. We're actually right now in the process of converting from Solar to Elasticsearch. One word Elasticsearch, not two words Elasticsearch. The open source project, not the AWS service. Now the shameful part, we're still running Java 6 and Tomcat 6. So the good news is we're upgrading to Magnolia 5 now, and it only works with Tomcat 7, so that's sort of allowed me to twist their arm and get them to upgrade the infrastructure. I think Spring we're on 3.2 right now. We end up being, I don't know if you guys have this experience as well with Spring, but Spring security usually ends up being the thing that's holding us back on Spring. Because Spring 4 was released before Spring Security 3.2 was released. I don't know why. Someone on the Spring Security project probably needs to get a little bit of a kick in the rear.
But luckily that should get a little bit better now with the I/O platform, so everything, we get really crazy within our organization to literally standardizing all the projects, that making even sure that whatever dependencies each individual project has plays nicely with other projects, so everything will be level basically.
And I shouldn't admit this, but we wanted the MVC integration testing library bad enough that on one of the systems I went ahead and upgraded to 3.2 and ran it with the beta of Spring Security 3.2 for about 8 months before the final release version came out. Don't tell my boss. But you know, it's hard enough to get people to write good integration tests anyway. When a tool comes along that makes it a lot easier, I put a little priority behind that and was willing to do evil things.
How would you contrast this versus LifeArray, which is more of a portal technology?
I'm not familiar with it. Is it a portlet engine? So I would say that I've often thought about the way that we use Magnolia as being very similar logically to a portlet engine, except that with a portlet engine, you get that sort of pluggability of individual components on the page, but you don't usually have anywhere near as useful a user interface for being able to manage and make live changes to content settings within a element the way you can with this. So you get sort of a portlet type experience, but with a lot of the benefits of a CMS application at the same time.
With respect to the different kind of front end, like a browser, I mean, like a tablet or a full browser, like where is it XSL kind of a thing that is involved to convert to different form factor devices or not?
So Magnolia itself has what they call channels as an aspect of the system. So we don't actually use it because we have not made a mobile version of the site yet, but we're looking at it. What the channels essentially do is they allow you to, for a specific template, associate multiple JSPs with it based on the channel. And then there's a filter on the front end that detects, hey, this is a tablet, so I'm going to put you in the tablet channel, and then it would auto-select the right JSP. You know, there's a great deal of stuff that we've done within the system that I would love to release open source, and the company doesn't mind if I do it. It's just a matter of getting around to it. Honestly, this is all in an open source project. So any of the things that you've seen here, you can go and pull and use. I've done some other interesting things that one of these days I'll get into open source. Like I created a library for auto-generating tag libs for DAOs. We've got a library, Vince loves that one. We've got a library for auto-generating a sitemap dynamically for all of your dynamic URLs on Spring MVC controllers. Basically just recursively crawls all of your controllers, generating the URLs for a full dynamic sitemap. So there's some fun stuff there. My arm could probably be twisted.
Does it come with a custom search engine? Can we add our custom search engine as a plugin?
So I believe that there is a Lucene search integration in Magnolia built in. We don't use that because, like I said, we run a separate Solr instance. So that all happens outside of Magnolia itself. So we basically have built ours where, like if you looked at our source code, you'd see a repository application, a repository library. Internally within its implementation, there's usually a DAO that is interacting with Mongo and a DAO that's interacting with Solr. And we sort of transactionally, when you do a write, writes a chunk out to the Mongo database, writes a chunk out to the Solr database to keep everything in sync.
What are your thoughts on Spring going forward compared to like Play or Java CI?
I love Spring. I have gotten to a point where I've just decided that inversion of control containers ought to be a language level feature of every programming language. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing, especially when you start doing testing, because writing really good testable code requires a certain approach to factoring that code that inversion of control and dependency injection fits really well with. Without that, it can get really difficult a lot of times to write code that's very well testable. So I love Scala as well. I don't know when the market for Scala engineers in Atlanta will get to a point where I would be comfortable telling my boss, hey, let's go rewrite everything in Scala. But I really look forward to that day. If we get to that day, I'll be very happy. Yeah, but Scala does work with Spring, but when you look at things like the Scala language itself and Play framework, they don't know Spring and dependency injection as a primary construct. It's not really what they're built around. But I like those two. We're also experimenting a little bit with Node.js. I don't know if any of you guys have played with that, but gosh, I wish JavaScript was strongly typed. Anyway.
I mean, probably nasty answer, but in terms of your website, your application, or moving web components forward, how would that, let's say, work with Magnolia in the background if I needed to want to move towards single page application, kind of like where I don't have, kind of like where everything's on the client? How would you?
So it kind of depends on the model you're going to take with that. If you were really building a model where all of the rendering was happening client side, then I don't know that a CMS as a metaphor for managing your page structures makes a lot of sense at that point. Really, I think in that sort of a model, I was at Weather Channel before ShareCare. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with where Weather has gone with their structure, but they've basically moved to an architecture that is a PHP CMS on the front end that does all of the actual page rendering, but doesn't have any of the business logic whatsoever. And then an SOA layer underneath that's actually written in Scala that basically implements the entire application functionality as a service interface. And so their front-end application is basically very static PHP templates. I think it's Drupal. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Drupal. But a lot of their dynamic activity is actually happening client-side, just making direct calls to the SOA layer. And I think for that sort of a design, that probably would be a better fit than doing it with a CMS. Or at least for using a CMS the way that I'm using a CMS here.
We actually have a client that's haven't launched it yet, but they're doing exactly that same page. Yeah, AngularJS and Flutter, just serving templates.
But it ends up being sort of a different thing because you wouldn't want to try to then integrate the business logic into what's going on inside of Magnolia in that sort of a model. Certainly not at the level that I've integrated it in this system. Any other questions?
In your demo, you just show text content. Is
Yes.
there any difference in serving audio visual content?
The main difference is that someone who's good at HTML would probably want to write those templates, and that's not me. I'm a back-end Java guy, so this is what you get when you let the back-end Java guy write the HTML. But yes, Magnolia is perfectly happy with other kinds of content, and people who are better at that than me make much prettier things with it than I do. Yeah, and at that, I obsessed about this. This was like days of work to get it this pretty for me. They're having more fun than us, too. Anything else? Any other questions? All right, cool.